Reports you at TopVelocity.net. 3x pitch biometrics here. Michael, take him through his delivery from camp just before leg drive. We're going to look at the knee and ankle flexion. The ankle is at 8 degrees of flexion. The knee is about 50 degrees of flexion. So not much flexion, a little bit more in the knee. Hip flexion we can look at too. But you could see not much loading there. He could continue to move forward down the same rate. We'll talk about that. But he just, the way he's specifically the trunk, how the trunk's leaning so far back to the rubber, the hip is hitting close to end of range. It's hard for him to keep moving down and keep flexing at this point. Let's look at the hip angles. You can see that hip abduction is about 23 degrees, and he's literally going into drive. So because that trunk's leaning so far back to the rubber, doesn't allow him to really keep the hips abducting and loading and even flexing at that point. It really needs to work to keep the trunk only slightly back, a little bit more to neutral. You can see hip flexion of the right hip is 23 degrees. That's not bad. It's just if I look at the tilt position, it's at 11 degrees back. So not loading the posterior chain well. The pelvis needs to kind of let the hamstrings extend, tilt to more of a neutral position. At this point would be a better load. The trunk not so far back. Posterior chain a little bit more loaded, more flexion, and that back leg needs to be more linear. You can see the back leg force vector is still very vertical. So as he goes into leg drive, everything really kind of goes up and vertical. And here's the thing: we talk about the importance of timing the opening of front foot to back leg drive. You can see the front foot is staying closed. It's not really swinging open, so it doesn't really trigger the hip rotation. So when the back knee tries to drive and really not getting much of a drive, just some knee extension, internal rotation, the hips don't really react, and we don't get the hips rotating. We literally have the trunk rotating without the hips. Okay, so that's a timing issue of opening front foot, triggering hip rotation with front foot as you power back leg to get the hips to rotate. So now we hit front foot right here, and we have a negative hip to shoulder separation. So if I use the hip and shoulder lines, we can see negative hip to shoulder separation. The shoulder's well ahead. It's an awkward position and movement here that, just looking at it. If we look at the kinematic sequencing, we can see usually we have dots showing what's peaking, but just look at the humps. We can see the green hump is the trunk, the yellow hump is the throwing arm, the red hump is the hips, the dark blue is the glove side, and we can see it's all pretty much scattered. We want to see like a step process. That's what the kinetic sequencing needs to look like. We need to see the red line hip go first in a little hump. Then we need to see followed by the green and blue line. Then we need to see it followed by the yellow line. And you can see pretty much the trunk and the throwing arm are going off together. And then later comes the hips and glove side. And like I said, the sequencing is actually backwards here in this throw. So I need to really work to time the opening of the hips and sequencing the hip trunk before the shoulder. So at front foot strike, you can see moving to a lot of contralateral tilt because the trunk is really trying to kind of over pull glove side to help force the rotation because the hips really aren't driving it. So if we look at the pelvis and trunk position, you can see the pelvis tilt is 40 degrees to the right, or that's the trunk. The pelvis is 6. The trunk is 40 degrees to the right. We never want to exceed 25. Problem is, once we exceed 25, the torques keep going up without the ball speed going up. So it becomes a very inefficient throw. You can see front leg really isn't driving either. The trunk is trying to pull forward to pitch release, and that's pretty much all that Michael has here. He has the trunk rotating aggressively, way off to glove side, and kind of pulling down forward without really the lower half helping to drive those dynamics. So it's really going back to the load, not letting the trunk lean so far back, getting more into the posterior chain, getting the back leg more linear, timing the opening of the front foot so when we drive back leg, it helps drive rotation. Then we get the hips to go early, we get our drive into front foot so we can get the kinematic sequence working, hips, trunk, arm, and then front leg stabilizes and tries to extend, and ultimately we can accelerate the trunk. The trunk doesn't have to rotate so far to glove side. It can stay more slightly to glove side, and it transfers energy as opposed to trying to generate a lot of the energy with the arm.